So, hello everybody. Welcome to this latest in a series of community talks organised by the Brighton Natural Health Centre charity and sponsored by Infinity Foods. We have been running these talks for several years and we film a lot of them. So if you go to YouTube, to the Brighton Natural Health Centre, you see a whole stack of talks about different aspects of personal and community health and well-being. This talk is a little bit different. It mixes a number of things. One of them is personal anecdote and biography. You'll have to excuse me for that part. Social history and a little bit of polemics about the benefits of natural and organic food. So this is Infinity Foods now-ish. That photo's a bit old, but Infinity Foods now is Brighton's largest workers' co-op, possibly the largest workers' co-op in the south. I'm not sure about that. It's got 111 co-op members and 21 employed staff spread across the shop that everybody knows, the in-shop bakery, the cafe around the corner, and the very significant and large warehouse in Shoreham that distributes Infinity Foods all over the country. As you see, the turnover now is approaching £25 million a year. So it's a pretty significant business. It's even got its own lorries. But it wasn't always like this. This is my attempt to chuck in one of those things you get in films where it goes zzz, 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 and you have a flashback back in time to 1970. So this is where the personal history bit comes in. I was a very good boy to start with. I was fast-tracked at my grammar school to add to their numbers of kids who got into Oxford and Cambridge, and I got a place in Oxford to study politics, philosophy and economics. But that was, I can't remember, 1965 or 1966, and I just no longer felt like a good boy. I just couldn't bear the thought of doing that. So to please my parents, I applied to and got into Sussex University. I lasted a year. I got kicked out. I had the honour of being told I was the worst student ever to attend Sussex University. And I blame the beats. There's Jack Kerouac, it's all his fault. I read On the Road. So this was the cusp, really, of the end of the beats and the beginning of the hippie era. And I imagine you all know On the Road, with its exciting promise of rootlessness and travel, and for a young guy, girls, sex, drugs, you know, all the best things in life. So sitting in a stuffy room at Sussex University studying 16th century poetry wasn't really my thing at the time. So I set off travelling. I spent a lot of time in Morocco. That's not me, that's Keith Richards, but I probably looked a bit similar. He's in Morocco, that's a Moroccan Keef pipe. And actually, there you see, I spent a few months in a little Moroccan village called Diabat, and where Jimi Hendrix went the following year. So we had a little hippie community there and frolicked naked on the beach and wove flowers in our hair and took industrial quantities of LSD and such like. So that, if you know Jimmy's songs, that's the castle made of sand. You know, castles made of sand sink in the sea eventually. And the end result of that period of my life is I ended up with a really nasty case of hepatitis, hence the yellowness. So despite my enjoyment of this hedonistic period, it was in many ways one of the most exciting, thrilling periods of my life. I also deep down felt a sense of shame and guilt that I wasn't doing something with my life. I was brought up in a high-achieving family with a Jewish mother and a Scottish Presbyterian background father, and they were both communists, and the communist idea was you devote your life to the common good. And here I was hippieing around, pleasing only myself. So I felt pretty bad about that. But the problem was that I had no idea what to do. All I could see were all the things I didn't want to do, which was pretty much everything. So anyway, there I was in this village, lying on my sick bed, which at times felt like my deathbed, to be honest, in an agony of desperation and will I ever get back to England? And serendipitously, this book appeared called Zen Macrobiotics by George Osawa. George Osawa was a Japanese guy who pioneered macrobiotics, which was this idea that diet affects us physically and mentally. It can heal us, it can prevent disease, and his particular take on it, although people got very fanatic about macrobiotics later, it was pretty spot on. Eating whole grains, particularly brown rice, lots of vegetables, beans, no sugar, low levels of animal foods, so on. You know, what we would now think not a pretty good healthy diet. Well, most of us would, anyway. And I clutched onto this idea like a drowning man because I felt I really needed to heal myself of the depredations of my hedonistic lifestyle. And I managed, with some difficulty, to get back home and decided that this was going to be my life's path, at least for the time being. So at that time, there was just one macrobiotic restaurant in Britain, in London, run by the Sams brothers. Craig Sams on the left, Greg Sams on the right. And incidentally, if you do go to the Brighton Natural Health Centre YouTube channel, you can watch a really fabulous talk by Craig Sams about soil health. It's long, but it's really good, really interesting. So they ran a restaurant in London, macrobiotic. They both went on to have big careers in natural foods, setting up a company called Whole Foods. Craig and his wife set up Green and Black's Chocolate. So the big natural food pioneers. So I went there and asked for a job. I took it for granted that I was a good candidate, even though I was still bright yellow. Had very long hennaed hair. I was wearing a robe and still wearing that black coal eye makeup that I got in the habit of in wearing in Morocco, and they said no. So I moved back to Brighton, and this idea churning around my head with no idea how to achieve it. And then I met these two people, Ian Luffler on the left and his partner at the time, Jenny. We were introduced by a mutual friend, and Ian not only also wanted to set up some kind of macrobiotic restaurant or business, but he had a bit of money. He'd been in a road accident and had some insurance. So we went on the prowl to find a restaurant to open, but we couldn't. I mean, we didn't have enough money. We had such a small amount of money. And then this wonderful catalyst person who'd introduced us in the first place told us that the Students' Union at Sussex University had a restaurant in the Union building. It had been run for a few years by a greasy spoon burger joint who'd finally done a runner, and it was empty. So we went and we told them how we were very experienced restaurateurs. We knew all about serving bulk food to people, and they should definitely let us rent it, and by God they did. So we spent a week scraping a centimetre of grease off everything, buying some giant cooking pots, aprons, spatulas, and desperately trying to learn how to cook. So this was the restaurant. It was called Biting Through. That's the name from one of the hexagrams of the I Ching, if you know the I Ching. And we were very, very keen on two things. We're very keen on real food, natural foods, and we're very keen on cheap food. This was an era, there's very few people here old enough to remember, one or two maybe. This was an era when the idea of kind of providing free food to the community was very big. There were the diggers in the States and groups in England who appeared at festivals. There was a kind of political movement to make good natural food available to everybody. So we were very keen on that. So we were dirt cheap. Our portions were very big. And most important of all, we were feeding students. And the thing about students, they don't have much money, and because they're young, they have really good digestive systems. So we deliver them kind of great ladlefuls of brown rice and beans and bread, like what we thought was unleavened bread, natural rice bread. It was more like bricks, you know, slices of bread brick. And they just kept coming. In fact, within a week, we had like 150 people coming for lunch. So we just ran for a year. We ran 10, 12, 14 hours a day, trying to keep this thing going. We opened in the evening. So it was great. It was really successful. We got these really old photos. We had a lot of fun. You know, we danced around a lot and made fools of ourselves. And then we noticed that people were coming to us out of hours and saying, where can we buy this food? Where can we buy brown rice? Where can we buy wholemeal flour? Where can we buy muesli? Because you couldn't. You couldn't buy it anywhere. Well, there were health food shops, Holland and Barrett, I think, or maybe in its previous incarnation, but they were 80% pills and potions, and right at the back of the shop you got tiny little bags of brown rice as though it was gold dust, but it wasn't realistic. So we started selling food out of the out of the kitchen, and then we decided, hey, we need to open a shop. So we had a problem. We didn't have any money. It's all very well serving food very, very, very cheap, but you don't make a profit. We were really enjoying ourselves. We were totally unmaterialistic. We paid ourselves virtually nothing, just enough to get by, but we hadn't built up any surplus. So again, we felt stymied until one day Andy the anarchist came in. So we used to have a lot of volunteers. We were a kind of hip place. People loved coming, helping chop vegetables and wash up and contribute to this project. And one of them was Andy the anarchist, who very faithfully came every day with his long hair tucked into his Rasta woolen hat, chopping vegetables. One day he came in looking extremely miserable. We said, hey, Andy, man, what's up? He said, oh, I've had some really bad news. He says, my aunt's died. I said, oh, Andy, oh, I'm sorry, were you really close? He said, no, I hardly knew. We said, what's the problem? He said, well, she's left me this money, but I don't, you know, I'm an anarchist. I don't believe in personal property, and, you know, I really don't know what to do. And we went, I said, you know, Andy, yeah, maybe we could help you out here. He said, you wouldn't, would you? Would you really? We said, yeah, we'll take it off your hands. So with Andy the anarchist's money and a bit of money from various parents and things, we went looking for a shop. Once again, we couldn't afford any proper shops, really. We just didn't have enough money. But we did find this place, a tiny little shop in Upper Church Street, opposite St. Nicholas Churchyard, in a row of houses. We could just about afford it. It was tiny. You can see there, you went up to the shop. Downstairs was the basement where we had a kitchen and where we stored all the food. Now, just I'll say in passing, in those days nothing was mechanized. We used to carry 100 weight sacks, that's 50 kilos, and if they came from China, they were 100 kilos, sacks down these rickety stairs to the basement, you know, and we kept doing that for many years. We'd often unload 2-3 ton lorries, all sacks on our back, which was either good for us or not good for us, I don't know. So I went and I found this shop, the agent showed it to me, we discussed it, and I became utterly convinced this was our place. I knew in my heart and in my soul this is where we were going to start, so I rang the agent back and said, we'll take it. He said, it's gone. Somebody else has bought the lease. So that was on a Friday afternoon. And I walked around, I remember all weekend, in a ferment with this kind of thing going around in my head. No, this cannot be. This is our shop, this is our future. So I rang him again first thing Monday morning. I said, look, has anything changed? He said, yeah. The guy who bought the lease just died over the weekend. I don't believe in magic, so I don't feel guilty. I think it was coincidence. I put it down to coincidence. So there we were. We weren't in it for the money, as the Argus said. They're not in it for the money. They cater for those who want an alternative and cheap way of eating. So once again, the problem of not being in it for the money is you don't have any money. And to show you, sorry, here's a little mathematical bit, to show you how useless, that's me by the way, when I had hair, to show you how useless we were with money, we didn't understand the difference between markup and profit. So just to clarify for the non-mathematicians and the non-retail people, if we bought something for £100, we thought, okay, we'll add on 25% and sell it for £125. We've added on a quarter. That means at the end of every week, a quarter of our takings is profit. But it isn't. As you'll see from the maths there, if you add on a quarter, your profit is 20% at the end of the week. So we could never figure out why we didn't have as much money as we thought we ought to. So we started catering at festivals. Our first venture was back-to-back, the second Glastonbury Festival. This is the first time they built the pyramid stage. Doesn't really look like that now, where David Bowie played. And straight from there on to the first ever Reading Festival, which was a different thing altogether. That was more people urinating in beer cans and throwing them around. So we set up, we packed our van with everything we thought we needed, cookers, gas, tables, went off and worked 20 hours, 22 hours a day, serving porridge and muesli and brown rice and vegetables. Probably did about 3,000 or 4,000 meals in that time. And we came back to the shop after 10 days, unloaded the van, absolutely exhausted, had no energy to deal with it. We just chucked everything down in the basement, including 7 very large Caligas cylinders, which we'd only used a couple. We'd had no idea how many we needed. So most of them were full, and we didn't have the energy to deal with it for a couple of days. We were just recovering. Then one day I was sitting in the shop, you know, up the stairs. There was this very, very loud bang, and the air caught fire. I could see flames all around me. I thought, you know, the way these things are, the first thing came into my head is that a petrol tanker had blown up outside in the road. So in fight or flight mode, I, without being aware of it, ran out the back of the shop through a locked door. I just smashed the door into the backyard where the air was still on fire. So then I, having lived through the Cuba crisis, I decided, in fact, it was nuclear war, turned around, ran down the stairs into the road, Church Street, looked back at the shop, and the whole of the front of the shop, the whole plate glass window had been blown out into the road, and the whole of the downstairs basement had been blown out into the road. And when I looked down into the kitchen, I could see all these colour gas cylinders sitting there with flames burning all around them. And I thought, my God, you know, that must have been one colour gas cylinder go up. If they all go up, this whole terrace is going to go up. But who's going to go in there and take out these colour gas cylinders from a burning kitchen? Well, the answer was a guy called Bruno. So this is Bruno on the right. He ran or co-ran an anarchist community cafe called Open Cafe. He used to visit a lot. We had always had loads of people visiting. And he was addicted to tranquilizers, so he was always very, very calm. I think you can see there how calm he was. That's a very typical Bruno. So Bruno went down into the kitchen, and there was a passing fireman who refused to go in the kitchen, quite right, but he agreed to stand with his back to a solid wall, and when Bruno said here, he was willing to risk his hands, put his hands out and grab these colour gas cylinders. One by one, all the cylinders came out. Our hero. This was the Evening Argus. 1971. So there you can see there's 4 people. Actually, the one on the left is the person I mentioned, the catalyst, who did all the introductions. None of them, I think, were there during the explosion, which possibly explains why they're all smiling. Obviously very pleased, first time in their life, to be in the local newspaper. But the sad side of it is that what had happened is we had, as I said, we always had visitors and people hanging around. There were 4 guys in the basement and they were cooking. And they took a pan of fried onions or fried vegetables and put it down on the ground. And in fact, none of the colour gas cylinders had blown up. It's just that one had been leaking. So just in case you don't know, it's always good to remember, colour gas is very heavy. So it sits down on the ground, but when you put this pan down, the colour gas came up, exploded. They were hurt, gashed by flying glass. And the very strange thing is we never saw any of them ever again. Around this time, Ian, that I'd started the business with, left. And Robin, that's Robin, the top left, came with a tie, I think. Oh, no, maybe it's not a tie. This is Robin here. This is Robin here. And that's also Jenny, who had been Ian's girlfriend, was now my girlfriend. And sometime after that, we got married, and here we are, we still are married. So Robin really became my #1 partner. We worked cooperatively together for many years, and I'll tell you later that Robin really made an enormous difference to carrying on the business after I left. I'm just going to say in passing, also around this time, I co-wrote a cookery book, which was very much of its time. Did anybody ever remember the Country Diary of an Edwardian Lady? It was a sort of handwritten book. We sort of took that idea and we wanted to make a macrobiotic natural foods book that was rooted in the West, because the Georgia Sorrel thing was very Japanese. It's very sweet, it's very naive, and there's a few things in it I'm a bit embarrassed about. We moved from Church Street to the shop in North Road. This is probably the mid-70s. Not everybody's there. This was some of us. Just one story I remember about then is we've been in business for 4 or 5 years then, and we considered ourselves very experienced, serious entrepreneurs, very well versed in business. So we often discussed this strange woman who used to come into the shop. She always came in a great flurry with a big bag that she kept dropping things out of, and big hair, always a little bit overexcited, always last minute because she absolutely desperately, urgently needed some oatmeal and some aduki beans for her face scrub. And she had a tiny little shop in Kensington Gardens with shelves made out of orange boxes. And we saw her, and I remember talking to Robin, going, you know, that woman's she's going nowhere. that business is going to fold, you know. Of course it didn't. That was Anita Roddick who started the Body Shop. And interestingly, she, at that time, she wanted to expand. She needed some money. Not a lot, a couple £100, which is probably, I don't know, 2,000 quid now, or 5,000, I don't know. She went round all the local shops, little Jewish cloth traders. Kensington Gardens used to be a very funky, strange, old-fashioned kind of place, asking if they'd invest in a business. And they all felt the same as us, you know. I talked to them afterwards, oh, no way, we're never going to help that woman. That's, you know, we just lose our money. So she finally, a family friend said he put up the money in return for half the business. Her husband was horse riding in Patagonia at the time. She wrote to him, but, you know, in those days there was no email, so letters took weeks to get there and weeks to come back. So when the letter finally arrived saying, no, 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 whatever you do, don't do that, she'd already agreed. So this guy then never did a stroke of work in his life, and when Body Shop was sold, got 20 million quid. So what do you know? We'd always baked bread down in the basement of the shop. That's Robin again, baking another brick that passed for a loaf. So we decided the shop next door, so we took one shop in North Road, the shop next door became vacant, and we decided to turn it into a bakery. It had been a timber shop. The basement had been full of old wood for years. It had all rotted, it had dry rot. So a few of us spent the summer of 1976 down in the basement with flamethrowers burning off the dry rot from the brick and the earth and smearing this filthy black stuff all over the walls. That was the fabulous hot summer when everybody else was at the beach. That's the building team. I'm the one with the hammer, and in the middle is our baker. I'm not going to mention his name because what I'm about to say will embarrass him. So he had learnt to bake in jail. He'd been sent to prison for dealing cannabis. Very strict in those days. You could get, you know, a year or two just for a small amount of weed. And in prison he'd learnt to bake. So under his guidance we bought baking machinery and an oven, lovely oven, and we opened Infinity Foods Bakery and Pie Shop. Robin just reminded me at that time you could not buy a loaf of whole wheat bread in Brighton. The nearest thing you could get was Hovis. Okay. So things seemed to be going well for just a very few days. I was his assistant, so I was baking with him. One morning at about 5 o'clock in the morning, we just started baking. There was a knock on the bakery door. I went and opened it. 6 drug squad officers walked in, arrested our baker, took him away, and we never saw him again. So I suddenly had to take over being a baker. Well, I thought, I know how to do this. I knew one or two things. You know, I knew, for example, that bread weight is strictly regulated. I don't know what it is now, but in those days, bread had to be either a £1 loaf or a £2 loaf. So I carefully weighed out a pound of dough and 2 pounds of dough and put it in a tin and baked in the oven, and everything seemed to be going well until I was arrested for the very ancient crime of selling underweight bread. Because I didn't realise that it lost weight in the oven. So that's what they used to do. That's what they used to do to people who sold underweight bread. It was a real crime. Luckily, not for the first time in my life, I pleaded naivety, stupidity, helplessness, and I got off. Okay, so moving on. This is Brighton Voice. Brighton Voice was a radical, I don't know, left-wing newspaper that was sold in a few outlets in Brighton. It was sold in what they called the alternative shops. We had this idea then that there was an alternative community, this new alternative community. So shops like our own, do people remember Public House Bookshop? One or two other shops, and at Sussex University, it was sold there. And Brighton Voice was very engaged in the anti-fascist campaign, anti-Nazis. Well, it was before the Anti-Nazi League, but they were always exposing fascists, of whom there were a lot in Brighton. Brighton always was the centre for the extreme right during the latter part of the 20th century. So one day we got a ball bearing fired through the window of the shop and a note, because Brighton Voice is a communist front paper, shops which sell it have had their windows broken and other troubles. It's advisable, therefore, not to sell Brighton Voice in your shop. So this is Public House Bookshop, run by Richard Cupidi. It was a great centre of alternative thinking in Brighton. It hosted famous beat writers like Allen Ginsberg and Lawrence Ferlinghetti. They were firebombed twice. They had 7 window breakages, and one day a bunch of Nazis came in and started wrecking the shop. So what was our response? Ha, we learned karate. Yeah? We had a friend, Paul Bonnet, later became famous for Bonnet Estate Agency. He was a super golden black belt in karate, and we were pretty sure that a few weeks practicing karate would chase off any fascists. Unfortunately not. In the winter of 1978, between Christmas and New Year, so we had, in addition to the 2 shops, we rented a property off the council at the back of the shops. We partially used as a kind of storage warehouse area, and partly we had craft people working there. It burnt down, and we were pretty damn sure that it was arson. The police and fire brigade didn't believe us. Robin just told me, I didn't know, that a Tory councillor in Brighton claimed at a council meeting that we burnt it down deliberately to blame the fascists in the same way Hitler had burnt down the Reichstag in order to blame the Jews. That's a pretty big statement. So we had a discussion just a couple of weeks before this, should we insure the building or not? You know, insurance surely was a big capitalist rip-off, but on the other hand, what if something happens? We were very short of money, but we did decide to insure it, and with the insurance money, we rebuilt the building and created a charity. So this was Infinity Foods' own charity set up, Brighton Natural Health Centre, and you'll see there an image of a phoenix rising from the flames. So Brighton Natural Health Centre, this is one of our earliest programs, again, like Infinity Foods, was years ahead of its time. I mean, nowadays in Brighton, you can't throw a stone without hitting a yoga centre. There was nothing there. We ran all kinds of courses in, this was 1981, I think, all kinds of courses in yoga and Tai Chi and lots of cookery courses, natural food cookery, and all that kind of thing. And here's an interesting story. Hanover Chapel was here. And that's where, out there, that green, that's the oldest cemetery in Brighton. So Hanover Chapel hosted in the basement another lefty alternative organisation. It hosted the Resource Centre, which was also got up the noses of the fascists, so they burnt that down. And out of the burning down of the Hanover Chapel arose Brighthelm Community Centre, another phoenix from the ashes. So, back to Infinity. Over the years, as we grew, the nature of the working environment changed. When we started, we were a bunch of mates doing what we absolutely loved, 100% committed to the ideal and the ideals, very non-materialistic. We shared decisions. They were just sort of spontaneously cooperative decisions. Everybody got paid the same, and it worked really well. But I think, as is quite common, as the business grew, and as the number of people working there grew to 20 or 25, the cracks started to show. We didn't really have any clear policy about who was coming to work there. It turned out that people had often very different ideas about what Infinity Foods was about. For some, it was just a cushy job that was just like any other job. There was a lot of people who thought that things like opening at an agreed time was an anally retentive idea, and the shop should just open when people felt like turning up. So anybody who's been involved in these community situations knows how unfortunately they can turn very toxic. So we went through a very painful period with a lot of disagreement, a lot of very personal battles. I didn't manage it well. I always thought simply by vocalizing what our core principles were, everybody would just go, yeah, of course, and agree with me. But they didn't. So we decided to turn it into a formal co-op under industrial common ownership rules. Now we actually, the three of us here, that's Robin and Jenny and myself, we owned it at the time. We didn't particularly want to own it. It didn't give us any benefit. In fact, it was much more responsibility. But we were the kind of stable people who were there. Lots of people had, many people came and worked there over the years and came and went. We were the kind of core. We tended to work the hardest. So we owned it, and we decided to give it away to the new cooperative. And since then, before that and since then, many, many, many people have given their love, their sweat, their blood to Infinity, often sometimes through difficult times, to support it, to encourage it to grow to what it is today. And although I've mentioned a few individuals, I don't want to suggest there weren't many other significant people in its history. So this was a window display a few years ago. Infinity Foods, cooperative, voluntary and open membership. That means anybody who works there can apply to become a member. It's democratic member control, one member, one vote. So it's run by its workers. People have a basic salary or wage, which is supplemented by an annual share of profits. And what that's resulted in is most years, members earn the national average wage, which, if anybody's worked as a shop assistant, knows that doesn't happen in the retail business. Retail workers are some of the most poorly paid in the country, and it's only the person at the top or the corporation at the top that makes a profit. I should mention something that people perhaps don't know is, I don't know how to define it, but actually nobody owns Infinity. If all the members of Infinity suddenly turned around and said, we've had enough, we want to sell the business, they couldn't keep any of the money. It would have, under industrial common ownership rules, it would have to be given to another co-op, the nearest other co-op doing the same kind of work. Infinity owns all its assets, well, with that proviso, meaning that they can stick to their own ethical principles. You see down the bottom, organic, local, vegetarian, fairly traded, cruelty-free, eco-friendly, and animal-free, maybe? No, it's not that. I don't know what it is. Animal-friendly, perhaps. And concern for community. So here are some of the organisations that Infinity supports. The Sussex Wildlife Trust as a corporate member, and also supporting particular projects like installing bat boxes in Brighton. I'm not going to read all those out. I am going to mention Brighton Table Tennis Club, which seems like a strange thing for Infinity to support until you go to Brighton Table Tennis Club, which is one of the most extraordinary ventures that I've ever seen. I went there and was shown around, and they work with all kinds of people, kids, adults, but lots of problem kids, lots of disadvantaged kids, and they have the same ethos. It's all about the table tennis. It's all about learning the skill. It's all about competing and winning, which may disturb you if you're not competitive, but it seems to do these people who come such a wonderful, it transforms them. It's a wonderful organisation. An annual percentage of Infinity's credit card transactions goes to chosen charities annually. So this year it's Make Change Count, which is helping Brighton rough sleepers. And of course, as you'd expect, waste food is donated to the hungry. Okay, so now I said this was going to be some personal history, some social history, and I'm going to end up with a bit of polemics. That means I'm going to lecture you. And I'm probably going to, everything I say, probably you all know. I know you're a self-selecting audience, but these are important truths that I feel very passionate about, particularly at this moment in our history, given the condition of the planet at the moment. So the problem with the modern food industry, and this goes back decades, I described it in a book I wrote a couple of years ago as a reckless, uncontrolled experiment in human and environmental health. There on the left is a typical supermarket shelf full of what I would call junk food, and there on the right is more obvious junk food, takeaway kind of stuff. And in this book I wrote, I mentioned that I'd read a novel called The Future Homemakers of America. And it was set in Britain just after the end of the Second World War. So you may know, well, we all know there was rationing, and it continued after the war. So it was a time when rationing was still in place. And the effect of rationing was that the British diet changed enormously. There was much less sugar. Sugar came, most of sugar was imported, so very little food was imported. People ate much less sugar, much less animal food. They ate lots more vegetables. Even the bread was not white. It was kind of grey, semi-wholemeal bread. And when many years later they looked at the stats, health stats of people who lived through that period, they showed improved health, in part due to this diet. So here we are in this novel, and there's an American base, and the Air Force wives befriend the poor English woman still eating her meagre rations, and they bring her a food parcel. And this is what the food parcel contains: sugar pops, tin soup, Oreos, cornflakes, cheese whiz, cupcakes, and hot dogs. And these were kind of considered treats and treasures. So I kind of use this as a symbol of the time that diet changed. If we take, for example, bread, this is how traditional bread was made: flour, water, salt, and leavening agent. That's either yeast or natural sourdough. This is what you get in bread nowadays. And the wheat that the bread is made from is a hybrid wheat bred specifically to produce larger grains and have more gluten in. All the evidence seems to be that's much harder for human beings to digest. And the baking method, traditionally, one of the key important things about baking, true baking, is slow fermentation. So often 24 hours, even if you go to, I don't know how long Infinity ferment their sourdough bread for. I know Silo takes 48 hours. And in that process, in that slow fermentation, all kinds of really interesting and valuable biochemical changes happen to make the wheat much more digestible. So we in Britain are very proud, shouldn't be, we invented the Chorleywood bread making process that turned flour into bread in 2 hours, thus bypassing all this traditional wisdom. So if we look at those additives, this is what happened in the good old days when you added poisons to bread, because if selling underweight bread was a crime, adulterating bread was an even greater crime. And that would send you to the pillory, to the stocks. You'd be paraded through the streets with a sign around your neck, which is what should happen, really, to some of these modern bakers. And here's a little chart about which foods have pesticide residues in. Nearly all oranges, most flour. This is non-organic, of course. And it's important to remember, this is thanks to PAN, Pesticides Action Network, who I think have a local branch. What's really important to remember, when they say these are safe, they only ever test them individually. They'd never allow for the fact that a food you eat might have multiple pesticides in, which may interact synergistically to create something more dangerous than the sum of its parts. So what's the result of this? Well, this modern diet that started in America was picked up enthusiastically in Britain and Europe and has steadily spread to the rest of the world, has been a principal contributor, not the only contributor, to an epidemic, a worldwide epidemic of what we call chronic non-infectious diseases. You know, the main diseases that afflicted human beings throughout our history were infectious diseases, plagues and flu and so on. Those have been reduced, not conquered. Now we have a different epidemic. We have an epidemic of dementia, obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, stroke, and cancer. And it's very, very clear that where modern lifestyles, and that's principally diet, perhaps reduced amount of exercise as well, where they spread to developing countries, these diseases start increasing and increasing and increasing. So worldwide, it's estimated we're going to face a doubling of incidence of these diseases within the next 20 years. So any discussion between politicians about should we fund the health service with a bit more here or a bit more there, they're completely irrelevant. There's no health service in the world that is going to be able to afford to support, treat, maintain this increased rate of disease. Imagine how much money it costs to look after one person with dementia. So we have a crisis on our hands, and it's not just human health, it's environmental health. This is what UN organization said, modern agriculture may be the largest threat to global diversity and ecosystem function of any single human activity. We're seeing, of course, we know this, massive habitat destruction, forests, priceless, ancient forests like the Amazon, cut down, hacked and burnt to grow soya. And where does that soya go? It feeds cows. It feeds the millions, the billions of cows because people are addicted to a high meat diet. It grows corn, which in the form of corn syrup finds its way into just about everything we eat. It's a form of sugar, one of the major causes of obesity. or palm oil, which is also environmentally destructive, which goes into most junk foods. The methane produced by these billions of cows is a significant contributor to global warming. Insect life is being annihilated by agriculture, by the use of pesticides. Essential pollinators, bees and other pollinators, are being wiped out. And it's not just in the fields where they're sprayed. This spreads to the hedgerows, which is the prime ecosystem for wildlife within the field system. It gets into the waterways along with fertilizers, destroys the ecosystem in the waterways. Soils are being impoverished because there's no care for maintaining soil health. Soil, like the human gut, should be a rich environment of millions, billions of bacteria and fungi and different organisms, full of humus. That's a healthy soil. Soil nowadays is regarded simply as a holding mechanism for roots. And then you chuck everything that they think the plants need on top, artificial fertilizers and pesticides. So it's estimated the world only has about 50 years of viable soil left before we face a disaster if we carry on growing food the way we do. And modern farming has extremely high fossil fuel inputs and is responsible for massive waste of food. So I'm not going to talk much longer, just another 5 minutes or so. I came across this document a while ago, which was the Natural Foods Union we set it up in the 1970s, full of passion and enthusiasm, and it was a group of businesses around the country working in the same field as Infinity, so Harmony Foods in London, there's Harvest in Bath, Sesame in London, Cambridge, and so on. And this was our statement of what we were there for and what we were trying to do. So I've picked out a few things. Now, this is 1975, which is over 40 years ago. But what we said then is absolutely spot on today. It hasn't changed. We said that a diet which is wholesome, simple, non-destructive to other creatures, other men, and I apologize for that. It was normal at the time to refer to human beings as men, like mankind. So thankfully that's changed. And our planet, and inexpensive is a desirable social goal. We wanted to present an alternative to supermarkets and health food stores by focusing on real food, natural food, and by joining together to increase our purchasing power so we could lower prices to make good natural food more affordable. That was still a very powerful theme. We wanted to promote what we called revolutionary medicine by helping people find ways to take care of their own health through good diet, through complementary medicine, and through these practices that the Brighton Natural Health Centre had brought to the city, yoga and Tai Chi and so on. And we produced leaflets on changing diet and how to cook vegetables and how to cook beans and all kinds of things like that. We wanted to present a real economic alternative to what we would nowadays call big food. Take, for example, Nestle, probably the biggest food company in the world, produces 2,000 products which are called food. I wouldn't call any of them food, or hardly any, about $70 billion worth a year. You can see some of these things, sweet tarts, crunch, Smarties, things I never heard of, junk, most of it. Or PepsiCo, annual sales of 43.3 billion. Now, I don't know if you've heard of Michael Pollan. Michael Pollan is an American food writer. He wrote an important book called In Defense of Food. And he came up with this 7-word phrase, which is much repeated. It's full of wisdom. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Okay? Now, I haven't got time to talk about not too much, which is something. So I just want to say that I just wanted to slip in, I quit Infinity in 78 or 79. I went on to study Chinese medicine. So in Chinese medicine, I'm very interested in that approach to looking after the human being. And eating less for most of us is considered to be a very important dietary principle. Mostly plants, probably most people wouldn't argue with that. But his first one, eat food, sounds very stupid. He defined food as what our grandparents or great-grandparents would have recognized as food. And if you look at this, there's not a single item there. What our grandparents and great-grandparents ate was the same as human beings have eaten pretty much throughout our entire evolutionary history. This is completely new. To try and survive, to try and feed and maintain the well-being and health of the human body on this is the reckless experiment. This is the dangerous experiment. We wanted to demonstrate that it's possible to eat simply, lower down the food chain. That means eating more vegetable foods, more plant foods, and to spend less at the same time. We wanted to support farmers who are enhancing and protecting the land. We wanted to encourage a return to the land through the use of spare bits of ground. So we've defined the problem, we've looked at the solutions. Just to repeat the solutions. We want a diet of real food, real natural food, minimally processed, or if it is processed, by traditional time-tested methods. We want agriculture that is sustainable, that doesn't destroy the environment and maintains the richness of the soil that we've inherited on the planet. We want sustainable packaging. I mean, one of my greatest joys, shopping joys, I have to say, because I still shop at Infinity, is going to buy vegetables from the best, loveliest selection of organic vegetables in Brighton and putting them in paper bags, brown paper bags. You know, that feels so good. Where else can you do that? If you go to Waitrose, every organic vegetable is wrapped in plastic. And above all, I want to sing the absolute necessity of supporting organically grown food. It's one of the greatest contributions we can make to our own personal health, to community health, to healthy soils, because organic agriculture builds up soil health. It keeps the water clean. It supports biodiversity. Biodiversity on organic farms is significantly greater than on conventional farms. And reduction in greenhouse gases. Bit more detail. There are substantially higher levels of antioxidants in organically grown foods, vegetables. Lower levels of pesticide residues in the food, on the farm and in the surrounding area. Higher amounts of omega-3 fatty acids in organic meat and milk. I've mentioned that. And lastly, really important, it's been estimated that if the world turned its entire agricultural system to organic, it would sequester all the world's annual output of carbon, because the healthy soils absorb carbon. That in itself would be a solution to global warming. Can organic farming feed the world? Yes. The yield gap between conventional and organic, if you take in methods like multi-cropping and crop rotation, the yield gap is only 10%. Remember that 40% of all food is wasted, thrown away in between the farm and the table. And if we eat a reduced meat diet, that can significantly increase the amount of food grown. So last thing I'm going to leave you with is some more words from Michael Pollan, the American food, well, he's a journalist actually, but he writes about food. Imagine if we had a food system that actually produced wholesome food. Imagine if it produced that food in a way that restored the land. Imagine if we could eat every meal knowing these few simple things. What is it we're eating? Where it came from? How it found its way to our table? And what it really cost. If that was the reality, then every meal would have the potential to be a perfect meal. So that's the end of my talk. I'm happy a few minutes to, if anybody's got any comments or questions. Thank you. Did you hear that? If I had a crystal ball, where would I see the future of Infinity? And, well, I don't want to speak for Infinity. I mean, I'm a co-op member, or maybe I can as a co-op member. I don't have anything to do with daily running. I can say what I'd like Infinity to do. I think the single thing I would like Infinity to do most at the moment is to bring back something that we used to do in the shop in the 1970s, which was to reduce packaging, as we had refill systems for all liquids. So people could bring back their bottles, fill them up with shampoo, washing up liquid, soya sauce, concentrated apple juice. You know, that would be wonderful, because however much we recycle, the most important thing is not to use unnecessary packaging. So that would be great. I mean, I'm on dangerous territory, but I'm going to take a risk. So I do feel in some ways the organic food movement may have taken a possibly a slightly wrong turn. I mean, certainly when we started, we were very keen on the idea of local, organic, and affordable. And I'm not always sure that organic guava juice grown in Kuala Lumpur forests is really follows that principle. There is a danger that the organic food movement can become a me, me, me movement. You know, I just want the best of anything in the world that I can afford and get. I understand why Infinity's done that, because many of its decisions are commercial. It supports a lot of people who can work in Infinity, can have a decent standard of living, can afford to raise a family, which we never could have done on our hippie wages. But I do see a contradiction there, possibly. And as far as the future of co-ops, I was very pleased that the Labour Party seems to be, and the Green Party, seem to be supporting co-ops as a way forward for increasingly running British businesses. I think that would be fabulous. So I think they've probably got a bright future if we get rid of this government. I probably shouldn't say that, should I? Okay, so I will, after this, I'll order them to do that. No, the other thing we used to do, it was lovely, it was a lovely period. We used to have barrels. We had a whole stack of barrels in the shop full of grains and things and scoops, and you could bring your own bags. And we fill them and weigh them and charge. I'm not sure, I don't quite remember why we stopped. It was either because it just got too busy, or it might have been health and safety. And kids chucking lentils in the rice and things like that. But again, how lovely it would be. I mean, you can mechanize all that. You can have hoppers, you know, with release, so you can bring your own bags, do what you want, fill them up with rice or whatever, seal them and weigh them. It's all possible. You know, but Infinity has got limited space, so I don't, you know, it would be lovely to dream that could be a way forward. Yes, we slipped through the net. So because we where we have this status called founder members, because we set it up. It means we can go to annual general meetings, we got one vote. I should say in passing that why I say we slipped through the net, because a famous book on setting up co-ops had a chapter called How to Get Rid of Your Founder Members. So, well, check the label. In the UK, the most important organisation is the Soil Association. So if it's Soil Association approved organic, you can rely on the fact it's 100% kosher. They're very stringent. Robin, did you want to say something? Not particularly. No. I think there's also a European organisation whose name I don't remember, but that's exactly what their job is. Their job is to inspect farms, to apply stringent criteria. A farm can't be called organic if it's in transition. It has to be in transition for a number of years, which is very difficult. This is why we need subsidies to support farmers, because they stop conventional farming, which means that their labour costs go up and their production goes down a bit, but they can't sell it at organic prices till it's certified. So it's quite challenging. My understanding, I'm pretty sure I'm on solid ground here, is that Infinity is incredibly helpful to other businesses that want to set up, really helps people set up businesses, helps co-ops set up, supplies them through the warehouse system. I think it's really already doing that. Is that correct, Graham?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was very much so, yeah.
Yeah. And in a way, what's interesting, you know, if Infinity was a conventional business, you'd see an Infinity branch in every town in Britain, which in some ways would be quite nice. But what I'd say Infinity's done is it's fostered, it's allowed and encouraged other shops. So you go around Brighton, there's quite a few shops that sell Infinity foods. So it's a different way of spreading what it does. Okay, I think that's it. Thanks very much for coming. I was quite surprised how many people wanted to come, and I'm really happy you came. So thank you very much. Thank you.